This is Miss Tevis-Finn recording from room 114. I'd like to open up with the very end of part 1 before we get into part 2. So remember I had you guys number the slides. So I do want you guys to start this new screencast off with, this is slide 20. And this picture is quite scary, I would say, because my question is, what would happen if former members of the Confederacy were elected to Congress? Just to recap, guys, the Republican Party is trying to take over Reconstruction and heal the country, and they want to punish the Confederacy. So what would happen if, when they meet in session in Washington, D.C., they turn to their right, and there he is, Alexander Stephens. He's the former vice president of the Confederacy. He was reelected to Congress. The reaction was anger. Many Republicans actually voted to reject the new Southern members of Congress. So my big takeaway, guys, for this slide 20 is that the government was not working, and the Republican Party wanted to punish the Confederacy, yet they were sneaking their way back in. All right, guys, I'm going to move on to our part 2, which starts with this pretty amazing picture. And the title of Reconstruction, this one, part 2, is Reality, right, for the freed slaves. This picture certainly shows that they don't have shoes, they're malnourished. And how does the federal government respond? What are the different approaches? So let's get right into, this is slide 1. Just this photo is breathtaking to me, shocking. But guys, please put down for slide 2 that Southern states, how do they respond to this new reality? They respond by passing black codes. So there's a picture of what's called a chain gang. Guys, there's chains around their ankles. So it kind of looks like they're prisoners, which is pretty true. So Southern states, guys, would be forming these new governments, right, when they were getting readmitted back to the Union. And they would pass the laws once they were back in session to limit the rights of freed slaves. So, for example, they would require them to enter into annual labor contracts. So they were forcing them to accept apprenticeships. If you guys remember, an apprenticeship is where you are kind of bound by this agreement, similar to a master and slave relationship. Several states even required African Americans to have licenses for non-agricultural jobs. So that just meant it was very difficult for them to find any other work besides farming. So my takeaway, guys, for slide 2 is make sure you know what the black codes were and why they were passed. Moving on to slide 3. For slide 3, guys, I just want you to know that these are examples of black codes passed, and the big example here is that they're just severely controlling former slaves. So example up top is, right, no firearms. So, right, they can't even exercise their Second Amendment right to bear arms, and they can't even rent or keep a house within the town. So these are just examples of the black codes, slide 3. Northern reaction was anger. They were infuriated. They felt like their country was moving backwards. So there were some moderate Republicans that, didn't want to go radical until these black codes were passed, and that convinced them that things had to change. So they joined the radicals. And now, guys, this larger group in Congress can try to take care of the African Americans and also, push their agenda through. So the Civil Rights Act is what they first pass, and it granted citizenship to all people born in America except Native Americans. And what it does is allow freed blacks to own property and be treated equally in the courts. So, guys, big takeaway here for this slide is that this Civil Rights Act is moving in a very radical, extreme direction. It's the opposite of slavery, and parts of the country are not ready. So there's just a political cartoon of the Civil Rights Act that gets passed because the radical Republicans are trying to protect the rights of African Americans. All right, guys, I want you to, on your notes, make sure you guys put down slide 6, the Supreme Court. So for slide 6, the Supreme Court is, at this time, made up of former slave owners. So they are not going to be on the side of the radical Republicans. So Republicans are worried, right, that the Supreme Court would overturn the Civil Rights Act. Remember, for checks and balances, the Supreme Court had the right to rule an act unconstitutional. So because of this reality, this racism, the 14th Amendment becomes a top priority. Once Congress can get this 14th Amendment ratified and added to the Constitution, it would be very hard for the Supreme Court to remove it. So I want you guys to look at the language used in the next slide. It really shows how important it was to protect this new group of citizens. So you guys don't have to write down word for word what the 14th Amendment says, but for slide 7, make sure you guys know it's all about life, liberty, and property, due process, equal protection, right, under the law. So all of those Bill of Rights that we learned in US 1, this is what I'm talking about, right? Access to a jury, fair trial. So guys, I want to move on to slide 8 because it's kind of hard to talk about, but this is also the reality for the freed slaves. There is an increase in violence in the South. And so again, people in the North, Congress especially, sees the necessity of the 14th Amendment. So just an example is this is a picture taken in Memphis, 1866, right? So 1 year after the war. 46 African Americans are killed by a white mob, and their homes, schools, and churches are burned. This screencast is also about how the government can't agree on this new reality. So I want to make sure you guys know that the president of the time, Johnson, is against the 14th Amendment. Remember, Johnson is a Democrat, and so he is battling against the Republican Congress. All right, so that one's a super important slide, kind of hard to see. But guys, for slide 9, I do want you guys to write down the Military Reconstruction Act. So that is passed by this radical Republican Congress, and it divides the South. You guys can write down into 5 military districts. This is a great cartoon to show why it was needed. There was a Northern general to oversee the districts, with the exception of Tennessee. So in the next slide, you guys don't need to write down the names of the generals, but it looks a little bit like, the Civil War is really not over because they rule over the South, right, with an iron fist, and they supervise voting, and they protect the former slaves from violence. So I do want you guys to know which states were readmitted using this radical Reconstruction plan with the military. So North and South Carolina, Louisiana, Arkansas, Florida, and Alabama. All right, guys, moving on to slide 11. Again, the government can't agree on how to act, and the president at this time is almost impeached. Just to review, guys, the Senate has to vote right on this, so I think they're only about 1 vote short. Why are they trying to impeach the president? He violates constitutional checks and balances. For example, he fires his own Secretary of War so he can do what he wants, and he even barricades himself in the Oval Office for a few days. So though he's not impeached, he kind of finishes his term quietly. So my takeaway, guys, for this slide is that, the government is not working. There's almost an impeachment, and nothing really gets done at this time. We need a new leader, and just in time for, if he doesn't look familiar, I'll go around it. I'll go over it, sorry. Slide 12 is former, head general of the Union Army that Lincoln had picked, Ulysses S. Grant. So he is elected the new U.S. president. And Congress now has a majority, and they have their own president, a supportive president within their own party. So what they do is they go after what they want, which is the black vote. So guys, for slide 13, we're going to talk about this in class, but this is the reality of government back then and today. So when presidents have their own party in Congress, laws get passed. So back then, the Republican Party was under President Grant. They were able to pass the 15th Amendment and even go after the KKK. Today, the Republican Party has passed many new laws under President Trump, such as reducing environmental standards and increasing tariffs on China. So if there was a Democrat in office or a Democratic Senate, then these changes would have been harder to make. So stay tuned for the new election in 2020, and let's see if our government can get more balanced. Moving on, these are the words of the 15th Amendment, but guys, for this slide, I just want you to write down the 15th Amendment and then write down that it protects the right to vote for all African Americans. So that's the really important takeaway for slide 14. All right, guys, so how does Grant do as a president? Well, he's a really good, Civil War hero, so he's popular, but he's not very good politically. He does do good things for the economy in the beginning, so he kind of just keeps what was working, right? So there were policies introduced during the Civil War. For example, I'll go right down here. So one thing you guys can write down is he kept these sin taxes on whiskey and tobacco. So these continue after the Civil War to generate money for the government to use. War bonds. Grant decides to repay this debt back to Americans in gold, not paper, to avoid inflation. He also, keeps tariffs high to boost American business. So it's pretty good in the beginning. However, for slide 16, this flag should kind of wake you guys up again. There is also a different plan that's pro-South. And so Democrats at this time were arguing that Republicans and Grant were favoring the wealthy and targeting the poor. This is because more wealthy people did buy bonds to help fund the war, and they're paid back in gold. And also more poor people pay taxes. More of the working class, right, buy things like tobacco and whiskey. So what happens, guys, is more liberal Republicans, those are the ones who were not really agreeing with the radical Reconstruction and sending the military down, they join the Democrats. And they push for removing federal troops from the South and pardoning all Confederates. So very pro-South. So a whole new plan. So make sure you guys know that's for slide 16. Put down what the Democrats are proposing. All right, guys, so for 17, this cartoon we'll look at more in detail in class, and we're also going to be talking about the rise of the KKK. But this slide, guys, you can just label it as Redeeming the South. And basically, it's just Southern Democrats, right? They regain control. There's, these new terrorist groups that intimidate African Americans and even white Republicans. And they do things like stealing ballots, stuffing ballots, and they're trying to redeem the South from Black Republican rule. So guys, takeaway for slide 17 is that the South gets run. I'm trying to edit this, so I'm trying to make sure you guys know that Black Republican rule is a figure of speech. And so for slide 18, this is what I mean by Black Republican rule. The Republicans, they lose their hold in the South. There was trouble with scandals. Some of their officials were caught, cheating on taxes. There were some bad railroad investments that led to a recession. And so a swing in midterm elections, just means that the Republicans lose their seats in the House and Democrats pick up seats. So now they can push through their agenda, which obviously is pro-South, and you can see how they portray the Republican platform. It says down here is for the Negro, and this caricature we're going to go over in class, but it's horribly, out of proportion and racist. But this again is the reality that our country is in. So let's just go on. Almost done, guys. I know I'm running on late. The end of Reconstruction is really the rise of the KKK. So that will be our last screencast, part 3. We'll kind of do the ups and downs and the failures and successes of Reconstruction. But make sure you guys go back and label the slides up through 18, and we will go over this in class. This is Miss Tev signing off. Hope you